Joining us now on the Deseret First Credit Union hotline as we switch up from basketball to college football is Matt Brown of SB Nation. Matt, welcome back to the show, man.
Hey, it's great. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, fellas.
So really interesting read that you just put out on, and I quote, just how hard is BYU's 2016 football schedule? That on SB Nation's BYU blog. So, Matt, let's ask you straight up, man. I know you wrote the article and a lot of people have already read it, but let's hear it from you yourself. Just how hard is BYU's schedule?
It's kind of a tough question, right? Like, I guess the cop-out is probably still pretty hard, which shouldn't come as breaking news to anybody who has had a chance to look at the schedule or has followed BYU. There's a bunch of really big names on there, playing UCLA, playing Michigan State, and playing Mississippi State, some programs who've had a lot of success. But what I think is interesting is that all of those big names on the schedule really have some pretty big question marks coming into the season. And I guess BYU would fall under that umbrella as well. You're seeing a lot of these big teams that are replacing a lot of key contributors, a lot of attrition both with quarterbacks and with coaching staffs. And so I think it's possible to make the argument that this looks really daunting, but it may look a little bit less daunting once we get to like mid-October. And that's probably a good thing for BYU football.
In the S&P rankings, 6 of BYU's opponents, so half the schedule, is in the top 40. BYU ranked 35th in that. How does this schedule compare to a Power 5 schedule, in your opinion?
That's a great question, and it stinks because it really varies so much between conferences. Like, I think BYU, if we're assuming that the S&P Plus is going to be predictive for next season, which I think is a fair assumption, this is probably a better schedule than a lot of Big 12 teams. It's certainly better than what Baylor is going to be playing next year. It's going to be better than, I think, a lot of ACC teams, especially if they're not playing Florida State or Clemson. But if you compare it to, say, somebody in the SEC West who has to play a tough crossover game and they're going to have, 8, potentially 9 games in the top 50, or maybe somebody in the Big 10 East or the Pac-12 South that has to play Washington and Oregon, maybe it's not quite at that level. But if it isn't, it's not far off. This definitely looks like structurally to be one of the best, if not the best, schedules that BYU's put together since they became an independent.
Matt Brown of SB Nation with us on BYU Sports Nation. When you look at the first 8 or 9 games, I mean, it's ridiculous. Arizona neutral, at Utah, UCLA, West Virginia neutral, Toledo home, at Michigan State, Mississippi State in Provo, at Boise State, at Cincinnati. Who are the top 3 teams in terms of difficulty on BYU's schedule in 2016?
Well, I think if we were just to look at what the math says, there it's relatively clear that the 3 teams that are projected to be the toughest are going to be UCLA, that has an S&P Plus ranking of 12. They've recruited exceptionally well, although they're losing nearly everybody except for their quarterback. And then you have Michigan State at 22 and Mississippi State at 21. I am a little bit more bullish about BYU's chances to beat Mississippi State, especially since they're going to be coming off of a pretty emotional game the week before. They're making a long road trip. I actually think Utah is probably going to be a harder game for BYU, even though they're ranked a little bit lower than the math. I know they're replacing a bunch, but given the psychological factor and all the emotions that are involved in that game, and given that it's kind of become a little bit of a monkey on BYU's back, even if there might be teams that technically have higher-rated players, I think Utah is going to be one of the 3 toughest games that they're going to face this year.
Certainly a compelling game, of course, with Kalani Sitake, who was there for several years, and that'll be fun. BYU's first 8 games, 5 in September, and then I believe the 3 in October. Those first 8 are tough. I mean, if BYU can get to November unscathed, they got a shot at I don't know, 8, 9, 10. We'll see how many wins they put up. But what do you think of those first 8 and how BYU can survive that, given the fact that they do have to kind of hit the road in September more often than not?
Yeah, it's really going to be pretty fascinating because when a team has a chunk that's intimidating, there's usually a game or 2 that are going to break it up, either a bye week or a game against an FCS opponent or some kind of overmatched MAC team. And that's not the case here. So those first 8 games, they're all good. And even the MAC team, Toledo, one that's replacing the coaching staff, has been very successful over the past couple of years and has a lot of really strong athletes. So what's going to be interesting here, I think, is how BYU respond psychologically, not just in the matchups for each individual game. What's going to happen if they go and they drop 2 out of their first 3 games? Are they going to be able to maintain their depth, maintain their composure, and not fall apart if things don't start the way that they might like them to, because things start off so difficult? I can kind of envision anything between going 6-2 in case maybe some of these teams aren't quite as good as we think they are, and BYU kind of hits the ground running, to 2-6. But I think 500 is probably a reasonable goal, and then there you're going to be big favorites in your last 4 games. With all of the changes that are happening with this program, I don't think 8-4 would seem that bad.
Okay, so you see realistically 4-4 in the first 8, and then a good shot to win the last 4 for BYU to finish at 8-4 in the regular season. Are we hearing that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable, optimistic goal here.
Should BYU fans look at becoming bowl eligible next year as a reasonable success?
I think even with this schedule being as potentially intimidating as it is, not making a bowl game would seem like a disappointment. There's a lot of talent coming back on this BYU squad. There's one, potentially 2, really high level quarterbacks. There's a lot of experience coming back on your offensive line. There's some great talent in your secondary, and if you're bringing all of those guys coming in at once, I think you expect to be able to be competitive and win a couple of these difficult games that you have slotted up here. And if they just, beat the teams where they have a theoretical talent advantage and lose to everybody who's might have a little bit more athletic teams, and then you're right kind of on the cusp of a bowl, I think that might be a little bit of a disappointment. This is a team that probably should win more than 6 games.
Does the new coaching staff how do they affect the perceived win total maybe of BYU versus last year, knowing the 2016 schedule?
That is that's the big question, right? When you look at the S&P Plus rankings, and that's really the backbone for what I had written here, that takes into account a rolling average of how your team has performed over the past couple of seasons, takes a rolling average of how your team has recruited over the last couple of years, and your returning production is the players who achieve stats on the field who are coming back. And those are all things that are quantifiable. We can look at game tape, but we can feel a little bit confident, at least, in what those things mean moving forward. But when you bring in a new coaching staff, and especially a coaching staff like that BYU's brought in that has some coordinators and some coaches that are a little bit less experienced, that's a huge wild card. We don't really know how they're going to respond. We don't know how the new coaching staff's going to handle clock management in a pivotal point here at the end of the game. We don't know how they're going to be able to keep teams focused as you get into October and you're physically beaten up. I think you could personally convince me of just about anything because there's not a whole lot of data, and that's not something that you can really build into a projection here. And if you feel really great about this coaching staff and you think that that's going to be the key to help BYU overachieve this year, can't really argue with you. If you want to tell me that you're a little bit worried about that and you think there's going to be some growing pains, and with this schedule maybe that means the team takes a step back, can't argue with that either. I think that's going to be part of what's going to make this particular team really compelling and interesting to watch.
Matt Brown of SB Nation dropping knowledge on BYU Sports Nation right now. Matt, if Taysom Hill is the starting quarterback and if he's healthy, and I know those are 2 enormous ifs, but let's just say that happens, how much would that affect BYU's overall win total next season?
That's a great question. I think I would agree. Those seem like kind of big ifs to me as well. I would be a little bit surprised if he came back and was healthy, the starter and everything. But when he is healthy and when he's engaged, he's one of the most dynamic quarterbacks in the entire country, and it's one of the few players I think that could single-handedly change the way that a game goes. And so if he's back, he's the starter, he's healthy, he's playing the whole year. Take whatever win-loss projection that you thought BYU was going to have. I think you could bump it up 2 more games because I don't think that there's a game on this schedule on paper that is impossible for BYU to win if Hill's the starter. And really, for that matter, even if Tanner is too. I'm not sure that anybody is so far and above BYU's roster and doesn't have any big questions that like a win is difficult to even imagine. Any one of those games individually is potentially winnable.
Follow him at Matt SBN. Matt, for those that aren't familiar with what you do in your writings, where can they find your work coming up in the future?
You bet. You can find my byline on SBNation.com. You can occasionally find me on Vanquish the Foe, our SB Nation's BYU-specific site, but you can mostly find me on Land Grant Holy Land, which is our Ohio State site, and I'm usually writing about the Big Ten or things nationally there.
All right, Matt, we appreciate the time as always, and if we haven't offended you, we hope that you'll come back and do it again soon.
Likewise. I haven't checked my app mentions yet. Hopefully there's nothing too mean. But it's fun. I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys again.
Thanks, Matt.